All right, so we have talked about geographic barriers that lead to allopatric speciation. We've talked about ecological isolation that can lead to sympatric speciation. And now we're going to talk about reproductive barriers. And these can lead to the development of new species and also maintain species. So reproductive barriers are the mechanisms that prevent different species or diverging populations within a species from successfully interbreeding, right? We said that was key in our biological species concept of the organisms being able to interbreed and produce viable and fertile offspring. So this mechanism plays a key role in driving and maintaining speciation. All right, so these barriers can act before fertilization or they can act after fertilization occurs. So we're going to divide our reproductive barriers up into what we call prezygotic barriers and post-zygotic barriers. So if you remember, a zygote refers to a fertilized egg cell. So prezygotic barriers are ones that prevent an egg from being fertilized by a sperm cell. So this keeps a zygote from being produced. Post-zygotic barriers are ones that happen after fertilization. So the egg and the sperm have combined together to form that zygote, but now there's other things that happen, other developmental sequences that don't fall into play, and it prevents the individual from producing, once again, viable and fertile offspring, as according to our biological species concept. Now, here's the table that's in your book, table 13.1, and it breaks up these reproductive barriers into the prezygotic and post-zygotic barriers. You need to know these barriers. Okay, so even though I don't have specific notes written out for each one, and I've just shown you this table, it's important that you know these tables and are able to recognize these different barriers. So we're going to start with the prezygotic barriers and talk about ecological isolation. All right, so once again, we are preventing egg from being fertilized by a sperm cell. So ecological isolation is the first one. This is just what we've been talking about that led to sympatric speciation. All right, so there's no geographic barrier at all. These species are simply occupying different areas of a habitat and therefore never run across each other, never meet up with each other so that they can interbreed. So different species of garter snake live in the same area, but one species lives in the water and the other one lives on land. So because they're living in these different habitats, they never run across each other, they never interbreed, and therefore there's no zygote that's produced. Behavioral isolation is another one. So many species have their own ways of attracting a mate. So meadowlarks are a type of bird and they have a very specific song, and that song is distinct based upon the species of meadowlark. So there's eastern meadowlarks and there's western meadowlarks. So only the western meadowlark is attracted to the call or the song of another western meadowlark, and eastern meadowlarks are not attracted to the song of a western meadowlark, right? So they have their own species-specific behaviors. And I would tell you to look up the mating dances of jumping spiders. Jumping spiders are extremely cute and come in a wide variety of different colors, and they actually have little mating dances that they perform. The male will do the dance so he can attract a female. And if he gets his dance correct, he gets to mate. If he doesn't do it right, he doesn't get the female. All right. And usually with jumping spiders, he actually gets eaten by the female. But anyway, so having these mating rituals that are very species specific are only going to allow the individuals that belong to the same species are going to be attracted to each other and reproduce. There's one that is not in here, all right? And what I want to add here is temporal isolation. Okay, so temporal isolation refers to time. Okay, so let's say mating at different times of the year. Okay. So different species may not interbreed simply because the timing's off. The species are reproductively ready at different times of the year, or it could even be different times of the day or night. Different species of skunk, they do not interbreed because one mates during the winter and the other mates during the summer. So they're just not reproductively ready at the same time of the year. Then we have mechanical isolation. So this refers to differences in the anatomy of the species. So in other words, if you don't have the right parts, then you're not going to be able to mate, all right? So if you don't have the right parts, it makes it a little bit difficult. Now, this is really most often seen in plants that are very species specific for a pollinator. I highly recommend David Attenborough's The Secret Life of Plants. He shows lots of different plants and their flowers, and you can see how specific some of these flowers are for a pollinator. So you can look up the orchid bee, and this is a bee that is attracted to the scent of a particular orchid. Because he likes the scent, he tries to get the oils on his body, and he used the scent of the orchid to attract females so that he can mate. So the orchid bee is attracted to the orchid to get that oil to create his own scent. Now, while he's on the flower, kind of scraping the flower to get the oil, a lot of times he falls into this little trap that the orchid has set. And the only way for him to get out of the orchid is to travel through this narrow opening. And as he's traveling through the narrow opening, pollen sacs are deposited on his back. So the bee then flies off with the pollen from the orchid, and he's going to fly off to another orchid because he loves that scent and he wants to get a little bit more of it to make his own perfume. And as he goes to the next orchid flower, he falls into the trap again. And this time in the trap, as he's down in there, the pollen sacs fall off, and he's now basically transferred the pollen to another species, right? But it has to be, not another species, another flower. It has to be members of the same species because as he falls into that trap, there's liquid in the bottom, and that helps to release the pollen sacs from his back. So it's very specific for that species, how the pollen is attached and how the pollen is released from the pollinator. And that won't happen if there's some other flower that the bee goes to. Okay. So mechanical isolation a lot of times is plants and their pollinators. But it can also be spiders and animals. So male spiders have a specialized appendage that's modified to transfer sperm to the female spider. And these appendages can differ with species. So the appendage of one male species may not fit with the mating organs of another female species, right? So he can't hand off his sperm if the appendage is not able to be inserted into the female's body. Then we have gametic isolation. So let's say two species overcome all of the above barriers. So they live in the same area, they mate during the same times, they have the same body parts that are compatible, and then we would come to this last barrier here. So it could be that the egg and the sperm may never combine. So if we're talking about internal fertilization, the sperm may not be able to survive in the internal environment of the female reproductive tract of a different species. Sperm a lot of times can only tolerate a very narrow range in pH or temperature. So that may be different from one species to the next, and the sperm may die within the female's reproductive tract. If we're talking about external fertilization, where the gametes are shed into the environment, I mean, what's to keep one species from fertilizing another one if they're all shedding their gametes at the same time? So believe it or not, the gametes are able to recognize their own species. And this recognition is at the molecular level. The coat of the egg actually prevents the fertilization from an unknown sperm because it doesn't recognize the molecules on the sperm cells. So those that are of the same species have complementary molecules on the egg and the sperm that aid in recognition that they are of the same species. Okay, so those are the prezygotic barriers. The postzygotic barriers come into play once a zygote has been formed. So there's still more that can prevent two different species from mating together. All right, so we have zygote death. So when two different species mate, their offspring are called hybrids. And the hybrid may never reach adulthood or even complete its embryonic development. And this is usually due to some kind of incompatibility between the genes of the different species. So the genes end up sending different signals, with the result being the development just stops, it ceases. And it may be the eventual miscarriage of the embryo at that point. Right? So the zygote never completes its development. So that's why we call it zygote death. Then there's hybrid sterility. So even if two species are successful at mating and producing offspring, the offspring may not be fertile. So this prevents the further mixing of genes between two species because the hybrid cannot pass on its genes. So for example, the mule is a hybrid of a donkey and a horse. And the horse and the donkey remain separate species, and their hybrid offspring, that of the mule, is infertile. So a mule cannot produce more mules. The only way to get a mule again is to cross a horse and a donkey one more time to get that mule. So the hybrid is sterile. And then we have hybrid performance. So if we take this all one step further, let's say suppose two different species mate, they produce offspring that are viable and the offspring are fertile. But when these hybrids mate with each other, the second generation hybrids are sterile or tend to be weak. So the increased mixing of genes that are incompatible ends up with individuals that just are not very healthy individuals, are not well suited for the environment. So these are all the different reproductive barriers that help to keep species separate, and these are barriers that can come into place once we have maybe a geographic barrier that separates our population or an ecological isolation that happens in our population, and then these reproductive barriers may come into play and help us to produce new species. And once again, this is happening over extremely long periods of time.